What you're about to hear is from part 5 of my Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at Theory Underground. It goes with the When Being in the World Gets Shattered exegetical video that I released last month. It is part 1 in a 2-part series on the concept of being in the world, which is one of the most important things to think about when getting into continental philosophy and critical social theory. This is a predecessor for being able to think about concepts like the episteme in Foucault or the field in Bourdieu. Really, it's a sort of crash course in a different way of seeing that is very influential on everything to come later in theory. So it's also very important for me in thinking about Timenergy, as well as everything else that we get into here at Theory Underground. Most of these are not made public, but I want to make this one public for a variety of reasons. One, because I think it's a good sort of peek into where we're at and what's going on and the kinds of stuff that I'm teaching. So if you want to hear me talk a little Heidegger, this is a great place for that. But also, if you want to see how I approach these things, well, no better place than diving in right here, because I assume an audience of people who don't have that much familiarity with Heidegger. Maybe you've heard a little here and there, you've seen a little of this and that, but to get a sort of basis in the concept of being in the world, this is a great starting point. And I guess I'll just put it this way. If you're interested in going any deeper than this, becoming a subscriber at Theory Underground is a great way to do that, because I have a whole lecture course on being in time that you can binge on demand now as a subscriber at TU. Also, that's a great sort of springboard into Totality and Infinity, the first half of which is currently available on demand, second half of which will become available as we dive into it this coming winter 2025. We'll be doing it in November. So yeah, get out the books. Time to hit them. Let's go. Where this lecture begins is me coming in after all of the students present had shared their familiarity with the concepts of being in the world or related ones. You know, some people were talking about whether they've read Heidegger or not, how much they have, how much they haven't. And so where you're going to see me coming in is after about 20 minutes of that. Enjoy. That's good. Yeah, and I love how for all of you, the hand tool presence ready, these words kind of stick in our heads, and even if we're not sure if we're getting the terminology correct, we're like, there's something there. And speaking of which, Alex Sappington, the one and only, just popped in here. And so what we're doing right now, Alex, and you're probably working, so don't worry about it if you can't do it, but people are sharing out how familiar they are with the concept of being in the world. And, you know, in your profile picture here on Zoom, we see you holding up the Joan Stanbaugh translation of Being in Time. It's the translation that I'm generally discouraging people from reading, only because the terminology gets a little confused, because most people are thinking, like, when they remember being in time, as I was just saying, they remember that the things are either present at hand or ready to hand. And that's like what people remember. And then if they ever look into it, if they ever watch any video essays on it, if you watch Hubert Dreyfus's lectures on it, if you read most of the secondary literature, it's going to use that terminology, as opposed to Stanbaugh, who will use different terminology for those terms. as well as different terminology for other things as well. So like instead of directionality, she'll say orientation. Uh, and the thing is that's only really hard to track for someone like me. And so I don't know, other people might not even have a problem thinking like, oh yeah, orientation and directionality, that makes sense. Those both are synonyms, right? Or to say that something is handy is very like saying it's ready to hand. That's totally sensible. You can see why these are synonyms. And then Stanbot is better about certain translations. The McKerracher Robinson, which is my preference, is bad on some of its terms. Like the term anticipatory resoluteness is famously atrocious. That it actually gives you the opposite sense that it's supposed to give you. Like we've talked about this before, but anticipation makes you think about like holding back, when in reality the term that's being translated there is a literal and figurative word. It's being used in both senses, and the literal usage of the word that's being translated into anticipation is supposed to mean running forward, and it's supposed to be used. It's the word that's used for running out of your house into bullet fire if there's a bunch of people shooting at your house and you need to it's like you can either cower down and wait to die, or you can just run out and face your death, by running into the bullets essentially. And so when you talk about anticipatory resoluteness, it gives the opposite sense. And the problem with that obviously is that McKerracher and Robinson just weren't thinking deeply about that in particular, but they needed to, because division one is quilted by division two, right? The division one of being in time only really makes sense in light of division two. And what tends to be the case is that most people listen to something or in preparation to read the book, and they tend to get through the part on division one, or through some of the parts on division one, and then they might even try reading. And of course, they're going to start with division one. The problem with everybody in the whole fucking world reading division one, but very rarely reading division two, is that division one is laying the ground for what's to come. And there's a way that people will sort of wash your hands or disavow what comes in division two because they don't like the direction that it heads. In reality, people do. People still sort of get a cheap sense for what happens in chapters 1 through 3 of division two. They get a cheap sense of it because they have this sense that angst related to the fact that things are finite, that your projects can fall apart, or that you could even die, that angst is something that we either live in fear of or take up a resolute disposition towards, right? So you can either kind of, oh, I'm not going to think about that. I'm not going to think about that. I'm not going to think of the finitude of things. I'm not going to think about how if I lost my legs tomorrow, my entire life as a runner is going to fall apart, or that's what I'm getting at with this finitude related to your projects. Not just finitude related to the fact that you're going to die, which is what people typically think of when they're thinking about being unto death or being towards death, another way that gets translated. No, existential death has to do, as Anne said, with existential world collapse. And your existential world could be the world of your career, the world of you being an author. If somebody who hates me wants to get the ultimate vengeance on me, the best way to do that would be to show up and lobotomize me. Then I'm going to lose everything, potentially lose everything I've spent so much time putting into my mind in terms of theory and how it relates to praxis. It's always going to fall apart, right? And that would be a form of existential world collapse. I might become a completely different person. It might make me better, by the way. So if my enemy came and lobotomized me, I might actually become a lot nicer of a person, and people will like find me much easier to work with, and I'll become like this beautiful soul, and people will be like, Dave's great now. So, you know, you never really know when it comes to lobotomies, but I'm kind of using that idea to be like, well, if I lost the ability to do theory, obviously I would lose my world of theory. What's up, Stephen? Welcome. So yeah, we're just getting started. And I'm kind of going into this by talking about how people have a sense for what happens in chapters 1 through 3. Maybe they read chapter 1 of chapters 1 through 3 in Division 2. And then and at some point in chapters 2 and 3 of Division 2, usually people just get the sense that he's repeating himself. And there's a lot of reason for why he's doing it. He's being very meticulous. But all of this is building up to what comes in chapters 5 and 6. But I would say chapter 5 is the quilting point of the entire text. Chapter 6 should have been the first chapter of the whole book, right? Chapter 6 of Division 2 should have been the first chapter of the whole book because it's the easiest starting point. It's the easiest starting point in the world. It's a really weird end point, right? Because if you read chapter 6 of Division 2, it's just about everyday time. There's nothing more intuitive, empirical, he would say, ontic, than our everyday experience of time, right? Which is just this infinite succession of nows. And specifically, this is a form of modern time. It's a form of modern time. It's also somewhat the time that Aristotle is analyzing. It's also somewhat the time that Hegel and Bergson are analyzing. Something he says in History of the Concept of Time is that there's only really 3 important theorists of time, right? And no, sorry, it's not Hegel. I meant to say Kant, right? He's saying that the main 3 important theorists of time are going to be Aristotle, Kant, and then Bergson. And he's going to say Bergson is basically working between Aristotle and Kant, but then he does something genuinely innovative, worth taking seriously there. In fact, I would say Bergson, in a very important sense, is sort of foreshadowing an existential turn in the world of philosophy. So that's very influential on the generation that is Heidegger's. Heidegger's generation. Levinas says this. Levinas says that my professors were primarily influenced by Bergson, Durkheim, Husserl, right? And Heidegger was, except that you could say that he was more influenced by Dilthey than he was by Bergson, at least if you're going to pay attention to where he gives credit, right? Because there's always that question of, well, could Bergson have been more impactful on him, and that's why he cited him less? Because if there's this sort of narcissism of small differences. Every great thinker seems to have thinkers that are too close for comfort, and so instead of spend their whole life grappling with why they're different from that thinker, they just kind of decide to participate in the conspiracy of silence against that thinker. It's a terrible problem in philosophy and theory. It's especially pronounced in the French world of theory, right? Where the French theorists, they a lot of what they say, you kind of have to know about the context that they're in for the true silence to come through. They're being silent about certain thinkers, right? So someone might be focusing a lot on Marxists, but in reality, they're talking about Althusser. Someone might be talking a lot about existentialists, but in reality, they're just talking about Heidegger. Or someone could be talking about Heidegger, but in reality, they're just talking about this one cabal of Heideggerians that has meetings down the street. And without that kind of context, you never really know what a theorist is getting at. And with Heidegger, he's no less guilty. Thinkers like Dilthey and Schiller, I think it's Schiller, they get referenced a few times, but Jasper never gets mentioned once in Being and Time. Kierkegaard gets mentioned in a footnote only, right? Whereas the problem with him burying certain of his influences here is that someone like Kierkegaard is absolutely foundational for his approach. You know, it's like he's over here acting like he's primarily influenced by Nietzsche, but Kierkegaard is arguably more influential on him, even though he never devotes a whole seminar to Kierkegaard, etc. So with all of that said, which I understand was a sort of rabbit hole off of chapter 6. And all I was really saying about chapter 6 is that it's the best starting point because it is very intuitive. I do recommend a sort of reading out of order, right? I do recommend a sort of reading out of order when it comes to being in time. Starting with temporality instead of building up to temporality is a great way to go. You can think about being in time, divisions 1 and 2, as sort of a split between, on the one side, a focus on being in the world, and on the other, which is more of a focus on the question of being, or laying the ground for even being able to ask the question of being, which Heidegger's going to say requires really asking the question, who's asking the question in the first place? What kind of being does the asker have that separates that being from the other kinds of beings it's analyzing? So, of course, that's Dasein, that's us. We have a different kind of being than the things that we're asking about. What if we're asking about God, angels, nature? All of these have categorical differences from our kind of being, at least in that we are the self-aware askers of the question, and that this question is not speculative and irrelevant to our lives, but actually this question motivates us in the world. This question gives us our directionality or orientation. But of course, now bringing it back to angst, we bury the fear of finitude by keeping ourselves distracted with superficial, non-committal curiosity. And so people can blame their phones, but in reality, that only makes it easier to do what humans were already doing, which was fleeing from finitude. It was easy in the time of Kierkegaard, which is why, and I said that he's a major influence on Heidegger. This is why, and one of the main ways that he's so influential on Heidegger, which is, in particular, the newspaper. The time of the newspaper had people chit-chatting constantly about things that were not really a part of their world. It brings what's far away close at hand and makes you feel like it's your business to talk about it. But in reality, people are basically gossiping about things that they have no control over. Neil Postman, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, will talk about the information-action ratio. What that means is you're getting all of this information. How much of it can you actually act on? Right? If we were all, in a tribe or in a small agrarian town and we were getting the news, it probably is news that relates to something about our lives. Like if you're all telling me X, Y, and Z people are bad, well, then that actually matters. Whether they're bad or not actually matters, because they either are inside our town or probably are going to invade us, or there's like that possibility that they could. Or if somebody in your town has been stealing from other people, it's like, well, I need to know about that, right? But if instead the newspaper is bringing to you information about a thief from a different province, who gives a rat's ass? Like that's not important, but it is what you end up seeing, obviously, even more of if we're talking about Instagram Reels or TikTok. I'm constantly seeing stuff like this. And so like the other day, I was just seeing some guy at a protest. He likes to go to protests and ask people why they're there. And people either give really dumb responses like, I don't know, I'm just here because, things are messed up. Oh, well, why are things messed up? Well, I don't know. Stuff sucks. Why? Fascism. Okay, but what's fascism? Trump. It's all circular. It's completely brain dead. And it's either responses like that or people being like, get out of here. You're a provocateur. You're an agitator. Get out of here, you white privileged piece of shit. Like everyone's screaming at him, throwing stuff at him. And it's like one of the other kinds of responses that he's getting. And of course, there's always that question with this kind of journalism, what's being bracketed out? And I use this example as a way to bring up bracketing for reasons we'll get into in a second. But what I'm ultimately getting at is that I'm not at that protest. That protest is happening in LA. It has nothing to do with me. It really doesn't have much to do with me at all. I don't even have, there's not even Mexicans out here. I get that my strawberries, if I were to buy them from the local grocery store, are probably being picked by undocumented Mexican workers. That's quite possible. But of course, I'm also trying to live in a way where I'm not buying the strawberries from there. I'm also literally, we actually grow our own strawberries and sell to the local community here. What even if I have this information that people at protests are stupid and reactionary, like what can I genuinely do with this information? And then of course, in a sort of sense, it could give you a sense, it could undermine your rosy-eyed, rosy-tinted sense for how noble activism is. Maybe it could undermine that. And that could change the direction of your life. But there's much less relevant information. And then what we're ultimately talking about is the ratio. The ratio. We have way too much information. Of course, the way I talk about that is TMI. Being squared off against what? Way too little that we can actually act on. And that leads to analysis paralysis. And so with analysis paralysis and feeling like there's way too much information, what do? In part, you feel like going deep into any book is going to be a huge waste of time because there's so much stuff going on. The moment you go deep into something, you'll miss out on everything else. By the time you get to the bottom of something that everybody's talking about, everyone will have already moved on. Right? You're supposed to pretty much form your judgment of a situation or thing in a pretty short period of time so that you can keep up with the Joneses, which is to say, remain intelligible to your peers or the people that you're trying to network with. Okay. So this was already a problem for Kierkegaard with the newspaper. Heidegger is going to take that whole dynamic and formalize it and build from it a structure that allows us to go from what's superficially obvious to something that is also certain, but much deeper. And I'm using this as a sort of way of getting to being in the world, right? And so I brought up the term bracketing, and I'll use that also to go into being in the world. But let's start with something that you're all more familiar with, which is the circuit of falling. And I call it the circuit of falling or the vicious cycle. I've written it on the whiteboard as A leads to B, leads to C, leads to A. And it's just like this circuit. And if you've been following along for very long this year, you've probably already got an idea that has to do with ambiguous, non-committally curious, idle chatter or idle talk. That's the cycle of ABC, right? Ambiguous, right? Non-committally curious. Steven. Yeah, Steven's getting a kick from it. But that circuit, that's the cycle of falling, right? It's a cybernetic feedback loop. We could think about it that way, but of course, Heidegger's no cybernetician. Cybernetics had barely taken off yet at that point. And so this dynamic of people being vague about their words, using words only in a way that's convenient and helps them in the social situation that they're actually navigating in the moment, never really getting to the roots of the words that they're using or thinking about words contextually. That's the ambiguity that we're talking about. Whereas the non-committally curious sort of mode of attunement is the one that is afraid to go deeper into things. It's also how to keep yourself distracted from finitude. And then, of course, the idle chatter is how you stay engaged in a mode of ambiguous, non-committally curiosity, right? And that was something discovered by Kierkegaard. He used different words for it, but it's the exact same dynamic. And you can see him talking about it in his newspaper article on the newspaper called The Public. I think it's an actual newspaper article. It could have been a little essay, but I remember Hubert Dreyfus shared this in some of his lesson plan documents, and I read it something like 10 years ago, and I just remember being like, oh yeah, that is exactly what Heidegger's doing with this vicious cycle that I am talking about, which he calls falling, right? But I'm saying that he uses this obvious thing as a springboard into something much deeper, which is going to be the fundamental existential structure of being in the world. Right? And so how do we get from ABC, ambiguity, non-committally curious, idle chatter? How do we get from that to this much deeper structure of our being in the world and use that to give ourselves a sense for what is to be done or an actual way of moving forward? Bear in mind that this is my interpretation. Obviously, when you're hearing me talk Heidegger, it is my Heidegger. I have people that have inspired it, but also I don't know of any Heideggerian who would take responsibility, who would want to take responsibility for my interpretation, because everybody would probably pull their hair out if they heard me talking about this. And at the end of the day, the way that I phrase things, the way that I go into this, the way that I unpack it is filled with a lot of decisions that come from a lot of thinking and attempts to teach this stuff. And so these are my decisions and not something that you would find in the scholarly field, right? But Being in Time is something I've been reading for a long time. And if you read Waypoint, as Luke referenced, I do talk about being in the world. Well, I also talk about wrestling with being in time. That's the name of chapter 1 of my book, Waypoint. And so I do think that wrestling with being in time is a form of praxis that is actually important for understanding where we are. But it also does something to you in the sense of preparing you for certain kinds of theoretical insights and discourses that you will otherwise not be prepared to comprehend. And that includes basically all French theory. And of course, you could probably say the same thing about Hegel, but I think that in a lot of ways, insofar as people engage with Hegel in French theory, they're primarily engaging with Kojève, who is a Heideggerian, who has done a Heideggerianized Hegel in the first place. And you can say his Heidegger is really bad, and you can also say that his Hegel is really bad. But the thing is a lot of them also got their Heidegger from the source, not from Kojève. So the French people have a bad Hegel, but they actually have direct lineage from Heidegger because they sat in his classroom. Levinas sat in his classroom. Sartre sat in his classroom. Jaspers, Arendt, they sat in his classroom. All of these, they were either sitting in the classroom or they were fucking somebody who did. Right? That's, with the French, it's very likely. Like the chances that you're having sex with somebody who sat in Heidegger's classroom, if you're a part of the top 5% of the intelligentsia in French between 1960 and 80, it's highly likely. And it's more likely that, okay, now I'm just having fun. I'm derailing myself. I want to bring it back to being in the world. And so the idea of bracketing, I said I was going to use before we go into how we springboard from ambiguity, curiosity, and idle chatter. Okay. Bracketing is one of the most important innovations or discoveries of phenomenology. And it's something that in almost all cases, especially Marxists, gets told wrong. People oversimplify it, and then they try to make it sound like it's something that it's not. And I've had so many professors, and one in particular is coming to mind, that gave me this sort of condescending sort of like, oh, but what's bracketing? Because I was talking about phenomenology mattering, and they're like, yeah, I always hear people talking about this, but bracketing, what is that? And it's really quite simple. I just said that we bracket out so much, right? And I was talking about thinkers bracketing things out. I was saying that a thinker who is super influenced by another thinker who doesn't want to have to spend his or her life arguing against that thinker, explicitly, might just bracket that thinker out entirely, right? So I was talking about Heidegger doing this to Kierkegaard. Even though he's using Kierkegaard, he only mentions him in a footnote when he's so foundational for being in time. That's crazy. Yep. And people can talk about it being a sort of German nationalist impulse, right? There's a motivation at that time to not be citing people who are not also German nationals, right? There was like this, we can have a conception of the world and only have a conversation between the good old Deutsch Club, the good old Deutschmann Club, just the German men will talk. You know, it's like that could be a part of the reason people do propose that as a reason. There could be other reasons as well. Kierkegaard was especially religious. Heidegger, during the period leading up to being in time, is you could say he's almost got a religious fervor for being an atheist, right? He's extremely critical of such things. Yet at the same time, he's extremely critical of science, right? Which gives me then the basis upon which to talk about bracketing as this innovation by his mentor, Edmund Husserl. So when Heidegger dedicates being in time, he does this to Edmund Husserl, his mentor, in all things phenomenological. Now, phenomenology properly starts out with Brentano. Brentano is a Catholic psychologist, and he is taking up intentionality from the scholastics in an attempt to argue against mind-body dualism. Intentionality is saying that to posit this mutually exclusive dichotomy between mind and body necessarily puts the cart before the horse in this really interesting way, because what intentionality shows us is that there's no thing and there's no mind that we can possibly posit or propose that isn't itself already a product of intentionality, which is defined as consciousness of something. So if intentionality means that we always have consciousness of something, where do we get off positing as a sort of basis for the rest of our philosophy this mind-body dualism? Descartes does that. He posits that. Now, Descartes, like Kant, is trying to solve the split between science and church, right? There is a huge split between science and church, and they both want the two to get along. I think that every great sort of nuanced thinker isn't going to just pick a side in an already existing game and then say, it's this side, but is instead going to go, oh, they both have a point. Let's see if we can't go to a higher level. You know, Hegel would say sublate and, you know, go beyond, but preserve the best within both sides. And so, you know, Descartes is doing that, and he uses this mind-body dualism and radical skepticism to do that. Husserl will say in his Paris lectures that what Descartes did was he took on scholasticism in particular. You know, the way that people will talk about this is that you had all these people who spent a lot of time arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and thinking that that's a serious conversation. And they weren't thinking about the real world, and they were anti-science. That's scholasticism. I'm being unfair. That's an extremely uncharitable approach. Read a little G.K. Chesterton, of course, if you want to think much deeper, especially in defense of someone like Thomas Aquinas. Or you can listen to, of course, Benjamin Studebaker's lecture on Thomas Aquinas. You know, but then again, people would say that Aquinas is actually arguing against the scholastics. We can be orthodox in how we read Aquinas, but of course he is himself challenging the orthodoxy of his time, you know? So there's something very interesting there. But to bring it back to at least Husserl's conception of what he's doing, he says this radical doubt that Husserl was practicing was being used against the tendency of scholastic thinking. You could say that radical doubt, hyperbolic doubt, is sort of the opposite of an approach that says faith in a whole bunch of presuppositions is the first thing that we have to do. Before you can even start having genuine thinking, you have to already have a personal, I was going to say personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but I think that that's a little bit more of a modern twist on it. I think that they would say, you have to know your place in the hierarchy of the church. You have to know the lineage of interpretation from the church fathers. You have to, it goes all the way down. And you have to accept a million priors before you can even start making a genuine contribution. And what Descartes does is he says, I see a million presuppositions cluttering the table here. I'm supposed to have an opinion on all of them. Each one of them frames how I'm going to read a text or a situation or the world, nature. Every one of them is getting in the way. This whole table is cluttered up with presuppositions. Bitch, I'm going to burn the whole thing. I'm just going to clear the table. I'm just going to... And so that's what Descartes does with hyperbolic doubt. And then in a foundationalist way, he's going to build back, based off of what he can know for sure, right? Husserl is going to be a strong Cartesian in the aftermath of Kant and Hegel being the two most famous people who, in very interesting ways, try to not be Cartesian, right? So Husserl is going to say, no, I'm going to be a Cartesian, but I'm going to be a much more rigorous methodological Cartesian. I'm going to center intentionality and bracketing. Now, there's also like the a priori, the primordial a priori. We could talk about that. And there's some other things that go into phenomenology, but I'm going to leave those to the side and then focus in on why bracketing matters here before we bring it back to Heidegger, because Heidegger is going to basically turn phenomenology inside out by bringing Dilthey in. And Dilthey is how we are going to springboard from Kierkegaard and that cycle of falling that we're talking about up to something more primordial, ontological, deeper, rigorous. So it's basically like how Heidegger is going to go from this average everydayness that Kierkegaard is being critical of to this much deeper hermeneutic approach that Dilthey brings in that he got from Schleiermacher, okay? But Heidegger is going to use that movement into or through Dilthey to turn Husserl inside out. And you don't have to know everything about their philosophies to just know that it's a very intelligent move. It's super, super cool what he's doing there. And in a sort of way, I mean, I love to think Heidegger and Marx. It's very difficult to do. I like to do it. And if you think about how this is Lenin's oversimplification, but it's a useful heuristic. What Marx is essentially doing is he's taking French anarchism and socialism, British empiricism and political economy, and German idealism, and he's taking all three of these competing schools, and then he is, in a sort of synthetic way, dialectically turning each one inside out using the tools of the other. Based. Great thing to do. Very cool. Okay, and he spends, 15 years in the British Museum working on that project? Very, very cool. Well, Heidegger's doing something similar, except that he is bracketing out Marxism and political economy, which, by the way, helps him see certain things that otherwise he would not have been able to see. And by bracketing those out, he's instead focusing on phenomenology and hermeneutics. And the third thing would probably, I kind of want to just say it's like the history of ideas. There's much room for debate on what the third thing would be. What's the most essential third thing? You could just say existentialism. So you could say it's phenomenology, existentialism, and hermeneutics. Hate to interrupt, but we would be remiss to not share an advertisement from our sponsors. And we're not sponsored by any corporate or state entities other than ourselves. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because if any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right, subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught critical media theory and critical doxology and time energy with my wife, Anne Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also, we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? There was a collab that I did with Cadell Last. Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' The Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023. And they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly, also my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker Seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Thank you. So when people call Heidegger a phenomenologist, what they're usually missing is that he's a hermeneutic phenomenologist, which is a sort of predecessor to deconstruction, right? People after Derrida will juxtapose deconstruction to hermeneutics, and they will say that these are two different ways of reading texts. And then if you are based like Jack Caputo, you will say, oh no, I'm going to use a little hermeneutics here and a little deconstruction there in order to do what I want with a text, right? So it's like, you know, Caputo, he can do both. He can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. But you have a lot of people in academia who take a side. They say, no, it's deconstruction or hermeneutics. People who take the side of hermeneutics are basically going to say it's Paul Ricoeur and Gadamer, versus people who are doing deconstruction. For them, daddy is basically Derrida, though, of course, in some cases, there might be a little Levinas or Foucault on the side. They'll say, can I get some Derrida? Supersize that with some Levinas on the side. You know, and that's kind of what you get in American literary criticism circles. You know, that's what Judith Butler is doing. Like, that's what she's doing. Or what they're doing. I think that they use they, them pronouns now. But, you know, that's what Judith Butler is doing. And so I'm talking about how hermeneutics sort of is a predecessor to deconstruction. Well, it's actually how biblical interpretation through Schleiermacher picked up for a philosophy of science or a critique of neo-Kantianism by Dilthey gets then taken by Heidegger to turn Husserl inside out. It's awesome. And so I'll say something about that in a moment, but the last thing I have to say to put Husserl away for now is that in countering the way that Descartes overemphasizes his critique of scholasticism and does this radical clearing of the table of all presuppositions, in countering his approach, Husserl says, yes, that was all great. Yes, we want to critique scholasticism, and yes, we want to get rid of all the presuppositions that we can to kind of start afresh. But also, there was a sort of emphasis error, a necessary error that comes from the overemphasis Descartes put on trying to be different from scholastics, and that was the trap of falling into scientism. Right. So basically what he's saying is, if at the time, the best way to bend against the tendencies of the moment to challenge the status quo was to challenge scholasticism, and that led to falling into scientism. Now we have to challenge scientism. And how do you bend the bow? Now, bending the bow, which I also say countering the tendencies, right? If the tendencies are all pushing you one way and you want to go the other way, that's when we say we want to bend the bow. Now, Aristotle and Lenin both talk about bending the bow, which is a metaphor based off of if you have an actual stick that has this bend to it, or a board. Let's say you have a 12-foot 2x4 that is like bent, it's bowed. How do you bend it back the other way? Do you just turn it upside down and put a bunch of heavy things on top of it? The answer is no. Anybody who's ever done anything practical knows that's not how you do it. You have to bend it the opposite direction. Bracketing is a methodological procedure for bending things the opposite direction. No phenomenologist worth their salt is ever going to just tell you Husserl believes this, Heidegger believes that. No, the proper way to say it is they are methodologically bending the bow this way, and that helps them see this. That helps them see that. That's very different from saying Husserl believes this. No, Husserl thinks that the prevailing tendency is this thing, and so he's very explicitly countering that tendency. He's bending the bow by bracketing out something. And by bracketing out that thing, it helps him see something different than he would have seen. It helps him see something different than anyone else of his time is seeing. And this is I think, deeply dialectical point as well, even though you will find no sympathy from Adorno for phenomenology. And you will also see that Marcuse abandons it, halfway through his career. So Marcuse writes a book on Heideggerian Marxism and then gives up the project, goes, no, that's not good. That's not going to work out. Right? Yeah, but none of them talk about this the way that I'm talking about it. None of them think about it the way that I'm thinking about it. And I have the shoulders of people who came after them to stand on top of to be able to say the things that I'm saying now. So I think that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can say that Adorno and Marcuse are good at what they're good for, but they're not very good about thinking about how what I just said about bracketing as a methodological procedure for countering the tendencies of the status quo or the prevailing moment or the tendencies of seeing things a certain way is necessary for doing dialectics. I think that this is actually, and this is not a tangent, this goes directly with anybody who's been paying attention. I've said a few times now that I'm frustrated by Hegelians and Marxists in their way that they will so quickly sublate anything new that I say. If I say something that's never been said before, watch them in interviews with me. Watch them. They will instantly take it and just sublate it into stuff they've already said and stuff they've already thought. It's instantly sucked back into their project. They instantly just say, instead of being like, oh, that's something I've never heard before, I really need to think about that. What are the implications of what you're saying? Which, by the way, in part, I think requires bracketing out your own perspective just for a little while and sitting with it and trying to think about where I'm coming from and what I'm assuming. And then probably that would require clarifying with me, like what I'm getting at, instead of trying to clarify what I'm getting at or what I mean, or really sit with it or think about the implications of it. The tendency is to just try to subsume it instantly into their own project. And subsuming something is also reducing something. And reducing something into your own project is not sublating. But I think for a lot of our Hegelian and Marxist friends, a lot of times they think that they are sublating when in reality they are reducing. They're reducing what you said down into their own little prefigured thing, which is, by the way, what is their prefigured thing? It's not just an ideology that they were handed down. No, because none of them are just repeating ideologies in this sort of orthodox way. They're all real thinkers. They're thinking for themselves. But the point is that we all get trapped in our own modes of thinking, in our own sort of logics, in our sort of behavior thought patterns. And we all build our own little castles for ideas. And we could say not a castle, it's like a fortress. It's a fortress that is meant to keep out sort of complexities that would require a lot of time and energy to really tarry with, to truly work through, and instead just kind of grind on what's in your wheelhouse already, right? But what I'm saying is, for all dialectical thinkers, it becomes very easy to reduce anything outside of your immediate wheelhouse back into your wheelhouse so you can kind of keep steamrolling your way forward. But that's not truly dialectical. Truly dialectical thinking would tarry with the negative. And what I'm saying is the only way to really tarry with the negative is what Husserl's developing as bracketing in phenomenology, which is not a worldview or a belief system so much as a method. Phenomenology is a method for countering the prevailing tendencies. And so what he does is he brackets out the natural attitude, which, by the way, is the status quo for scientism. Scientism assumes a sort of crude materialism, which is naturalism. And so the natural attitude is what he's bracketing out. And that's why people call him an idealist, because he's bracketing out the natural world and saying, I'm going to start with mind, because perception starts with mind. And we can sit here and say that perception is a reaction to material conditions. And we can sit here and then talk about what's going on out there. But then we're already doing this inside out there, inside versus out there dichotomy that we want to get away from, right? And so that dualism was something that Descartes took on in a dogmatic way that gets passed on to this sort of natural attitude scientism of a sort of subject-object dichotomy. Dialectics has its own way of trying to get out of this, but it tries to do it too quickly and isn't really able to tarry with what could be called superstructure, which could be called mind, which could be called ideas, right? And so what Heidegger is going to do, though, is come along and say, so look, Descartes countered scholasticism. That was pretty cool. Husserl countered scientism. That's pretty cool. He sets himself then to using the tools of those predecessors to take on this Cartesianism, subject-object dichotomy, etc., scientism, and also what has become of religion, though at the same time, I think he wants to clear the ground for a new kind of approach towards religion, which is why most of the really interesting stuff that happens in theology in the 20th century is hugely influenced by people who read Heidegger, right? But being in time is this clearing project. And being in the world is the way that Dasein exists. In fact, I think that the term that Heidegger uses here is, he says, it's that being in the world is the fundamental structure in Dasein. Okay. You could think about it, since everybody's a little familiar with Lacan at this point, as a Mobius strip between Dasein and being in the world. Or you could think of the Borromean knot being at the center of being in the world, which makes it impossible to talk about the subject and the object dichotomy in the ways of old. And I think that you should do that, because Lacan does that in a way that he wouldn't have if he wasn't influenced by Heidegger. He was a big-time Heideggerian. He translated Heidegger. He went and hung out and got a picture with Heidegger. I think he had sex with Heidegger's wife. I don't know. I think there's all kinds of drama about that. So, Lacan was a sleazy dude who kept having sex with everybody's wives. But that was a generation of broken homes, broken families. It was the sort of beginning of the society of divorce, right? So nothing to model, nothing to aspire towards, but certainly a fact. That generation was promiscuous, to say the least, right? These are the people who were like the hippies, but they were doing it behind closed doors. The hippies we're like, let's just stop doing it behind closed doors and lying to ourselves. Okay, this is not exactly a digression because it is important to really point out that Lacan was a Heideggerian, and that the Bohemian knot actually maps to that threefold structure Heidegger gets from Dilthey that we get to by springboarding off of the ontic average everyday situation that Kierkegaard was talking about with the newspaper. Okay, the three fundamental existentialia, which is to say existential structures of being in the world, are Verstehen, Befindlichkeit, and Rede, which are German words for basically understanding, attunement, and discourse. But we could also say modal understanding, not cognitive conceptual understanding like for other philosophers. No, Verstehen is about your gut sense for things. It's pre-scientific, it's pre-cognitive, it's pre-conceptual. You have a gut sense for things. If you feel like there's something off about somebody, maybe that's all in your head, but it's actually in your gut. And maybe it's just some, residual effect from some trauma that happened in the past. And it says more about you than it does about that person. Okay, but also you should pay attention to your spidey senses, and your spidey senses will give you something to go off of when then thinking about how a person behaves. So if a person's acting weird and someone else says that person's acting weird, you say, I had a weird feeling about that person. Well, that weird feeling you had was prior to the conceptualization, rationalization, cherry picking of certain data or behaviors from the world. That gut sense is what we mean by Verstehen. So it's not just a gut sense, though, for what is. It's a gut sense for what I said is modal. It's modal possibilities, which is to say, let's just say, you feel like there's something off about somebody, like they're a little not attached to reality, they're acting in an erratic way. Well, what does that mean? It means that they might be dangerous, they might hurt themselves, they might hurt you, they might hurt your family, right? There's a reason why people should try to act not necessarily normal, but within certain parameters, because if you're giving parents who care about the safety of their children and the area, like this sense that you're an erratic, dangerous person, it's not going to go well for you, right? It's going to burn bridges that you're not even aware of, certain possibilities. So this certain possibilities idea is really big for Heidegger, and I think it's one of my favorite things about him as a thinker is that no other thinker that I am aware of thinks as deeply about possibilities. Deleuze will in his own way talk about the virtual, and this is a sort of way of him taking something from this. And I think Bergson does a little something here, but really nobody's thinking about how we project ourselves onto a horizon of possibilities the way that Heidegger's thinking about it. So Verstehen, as the first of these three these existential categories, existentialia, he calls them, is super important. Being in Time begins, chapter 1 begins with the idea that if you're not choosing your life, you're losing your life. Which is to say, if you're not living actively, but are instead living passively, you're not just missing opportunities to become who you could become, but yeah, you're also going to wake up one day and it will be too late. Which is to also say the habitus that you have formed is now working against you so much, it's going to be quite the uphill battle. I'll use an example. There's a morbidly obese man who is the father of a friend. He has 3 months to live. He just found that out 3 days ago. His entire life, when he's not doing a job that is mundane, repetitive labor at a mill, has been sitting on the couch overeating. watching TV and doing the bare minimum. He's been doing the bare minimum, and up until, here's the thing, this is what's tragic about it. How many times do you think a person like that tries to change? My guess is that a person like that tries to change about as often as I try to change. I'm not going to assume that that person tries less often than I do, right? But I know that people try, and then when the change doesn't work out and you fall back into your habits, it's absolutely soul crushing. And then you sit there and you eat on the couch watching TV in a state of dejected depression, right? Right. And it's this really harmful cycle, right? Totally is. So I'm not sitting in a place of judgment. There's a million times I've tried to get on an exercise regime. There's different diets that I've tried. I always fall off, right? So I'm not sitting in a place of judgment. But it got, the obesity got to a point that was so extreme that he had all of these other issues that required surgery before he could get active. So he couldn't get active to lose the weight because of these other issues that had developed. But he couldn't get the surgeries to address those issues until he lost the weight. That's a hell of a problem. And so then what did they do? They put him on some medication. He's on some drugs that were supposed to help with the weight so that he could lose enough weight so that he could get the surgeries, right? The problem is that those medications, the doctors are telling him, are what caused the cancer. And yeah, that's a hell of a thing when you're trying to get your life together, and then the only way out of the vicious cycle that you're in requires drugs that then give you the cancer, right? So, but this is an example of being trapped in a habitus that you can't get out of. And that's what Heidegger is worried about when he says that if you're not choosing your life, you're losing your life. He doesn't put it in a way that rhymes like I do, that's all catchy, but he says it right there on the first page. And if we had more time, we would spend a lot more time reading quotes. But this is really just the first in a series. I only have another 20 minutes. I want to give you all an opportunity to ask quick questions. I'm sorry we don't have time for real questions. We'll hopefully be able to do a follow-up here soon. I'm hoping that people who watch this will be at the next one because this will require a short series that will sort of get you all up to speed on some of the basics from being in time. But I got to get through the other two here. So I gave you all a sense for what Vistirhin is getting at, which is your existential possibilities, your modal existential possibilities. I say modal existential because in analytic philosophy, they talk a lot about modal logic and modal possibilities, but that's where they start doing like these speculative sort of things where they'll talk about, well, is it possible in any other world? And they're doing like these leaps that feel very remote from like your lived experience. And Heidegger is really sticking to your lived experience. And all of us as thinkers getting into the life of the mind start in Plato's cave. And that's why Plato tells that story to the teenagers he was surrounded by, right? He had little people like Alcibiades and the future Alexander the Great, those kinds of people all around him. I'm not saying that Socrates actually had Alexander the Great, but you know what I mean? Like that's the culture, surrounded by these up and coming boys who are like full of a desire to make things happen. And of course, what's the problem with trying to teach younger men? It's that they all think they can do what you're doing without any effort, that they're just naturally endowed with superhuman greatness, and that it's impossible for them to see their own shortcomings, except for the ones that they obsess over that actually don't really matter, right? That's the problem with teaching younger people, especially men. And so, what does Socrates do? He tells a story about the cave and about how, getting out of the cave actually requires somebody dragging you away from the images or shadows that you've been interpreting on the wall, right? Well, this is sort of the springboard from Kierkegaard's superficial, ambiguous, non-committally curious, idle chatter, falling cycle to something deeper. We all find ourselves at some point between the ages of 14 and 35, I'll say, somewhere in that range, saying, wait a minute, I haven't really been choosing my my life choices. Like those life choices were being made not just with insufficient data or information. That's neither here nor there. Everyone has insufficient information for making decisions always. That's never going to change. It might be worse than it used to be, but it is just the situation. The point is how deliberately, how actively were you choosing your choices, right? And so if you're gauging your possibilities, are you living within the possibilities other people have laid out for you? Or are you discovering those possibilities that are only your possibilities? I guarantee you, nobody else can do what I'm doing. I have spent the last 10 years of reading this book, really honing in on my own possibilities. And I think I was even ignorant of that or when I wrote the introduction to underground theory, in which I was basically kind of saying, I'm trying to do this so that anybody could do this. But also, like, the more I've thought about that, it's like, yeah, but everything is so uniquely like coming from my particularity. The fact that we're doing this farm thing, that wouldn't have been possible, except my parents have sacrificed everything they have to build this in the last 7 years. And what came before those 7 years to get them to the decision to do that, right? Like those are uniquely my own most possibilities. The idea that we felt like we had to move here now because they're about to enter their 70s, and you don't get to spend the early 70s with your parents ever again. It's a very, like, you do it now or never, because by the time they're 80, the opportunity's gone. They're going to be set in their ways. They'll have, if they don't have people constantly around them keeping them on their toes, they will just slowly descend into some state of memory loss and forget who everybody is. Like, parents need other people around them in those times the most, when they're grandparents especially. And it's that's existential finitude, thinking, what are my own most possibilities here? And Anne and I were weighing those possibilities against the more generic das Man or they self kind of possibilities, the kind of possibilities laid out for people like us, which would be like grad school. Go do grad school in a different country, right? We're very, very serious about those possibilities. We almost did those things. And then we were like, no, this is what's, we could always get the PhD, but we cannot always be here for my parents in their 70s, decide to have children, then be grandparents. It's only now, right? We have to do it. And so in a sort of sense, your own most possibilities can lay claim to you and hijack your entire path forward if your path forward was one laid out by Das Man. So if you're somewhat attached to your social identity that has been laid out for you by your culture, paying attention to what's particularly your own most possibilities is scary, because it can actually lead to the disintegration of your self-image and your place in your social field, which is to say, it could be a form of symbolic suicide. And as soon as you hear symbolic suicide, what does that actually mean? That always means death drive, if you're thinking as Lacanian. Right? When you think, how does death drive come along and mess up the attainment of the pleasure principle for you, beyond the fact that pleasure principle is impossible, right? Like beyond the fact that perfectionism is impossible. Well, death drive always returns with this vengeance in a way that puts your symbolic identity at stake. You're on this path, you've made sense of yourself, other people have made sense of you, you are intelligible to yourself and to others, at least more or less. Now something's going to ruin all of that. Well, what I'm saying is that being towards death in a Heideggerian way will undermine your ability to live in this cycle of falling down there in Plato's cave. It'll make it hard to come back down into Plato's cave. Remember, it's hard to come back. You come back and people don't find you intelligible anymore, right? These two things should be thought together. Okay, but if we start with the ontic shadows on the wall, those things that are the most obvious to us, which is that as soon as you want to take charge in your life, you're surrounded by people who are just passing the word along in a sort of non-committally curious, ambiguous, idle, chit-chatty way. If we start with that fact, what comes next? How do you go deeper? And how Heidegger goes deeper is by going from these three things: ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and then idle chatter, going from those three things to the much deeper three things that he gets from Dilthey's structure, which is Visterhin, modal possibilities, that kind of understanding, attunement, or sort of your fundamental fact that you'll always be disposed at the level of mood. And then finally, discourse, which Lacan will later call the symbolic order. These are the three fundamental existentialia of being in the world. And we can be more certain of these than we can be of subject and object. We can be more certain of these than any kind of scholastic dogmas or scientistic beliefs, right? We can be more certain of this kind of modal understanding, this kind of attunement that we are always predisposed towards, and then also of the symbolic order in discourse. We can be more certain that those three things not only exist, but are equally existing, that no one of those comes before the other. This is why Heidegger calls them equiprimordial. Each is equally primordial. Equiprimordial means they're each equally primordial. To say that these three things are equally primordial, though, is to say these are fundamental. And it's very easy for us to say we can be more certain of these three things being equiprimordial than we can of the subject-object dichotomy. Even if you want to try to put that subject-object dichotomy into some kind of a dialectic to get out of the mutually exclusiveness of that dichotomy, yeah, well, at that point, you're trying to bootstrap back together Humpty Dumpty here. And what Heidegger is saying is, yeah, but what I'm talking about is more certain than that subject-object dichotomy. It's more certain than mind versus matter. It's more certain than God versus man. It's more certain than the idea that we're created in the image of God or monkeys. This is more certain than anything. And it also is a deep, deep possibility for us. So you take the actuality of ambiguity, you might say an ambiguous gut sense we have for the words that we use when we're passing along the daily news or what's trending. We take that and say, well, that means that we're the kind of beings who have a gut sense for things. We can work with that. We know that for certain. So we start with ambiguity. Not only does ambiguity necessarily lead us to the idea that we can be more clear about things, we can strive for being clearer about things, but it also tells us that if we have a gut sense for things that is pre-scientific, pre-cognitive, pre-comprehension, well, guess what? That means that that's before ideology. That means that that's before a philosophical school of thought. That's a lot to work with. Okay, well, same with attunement. If we are always in this sort of state of curiosity that is a distraction from fear, that's also an attunement. But that means that we have other possibilities of attunement. In fact, we have other possibilities of attunement that might free us from that mode. And that's why being unto death and what I told you is a terrible translation, anticipatory resoluteness, come in here. Because running out into the bullet storm, courage, bending the bow against cowardice and saying, no, I'm going to live my life deliberately. I'm going to make big decisions. I'm going to commit to getting to the bottom of things. I'm going to go hard. That skin in the game approach, that choosing to live life actively instead of passively, that embracing finitude, tarrying with negativity in this existential sense. As Pascal says, if people could only sit in the room for a few hours, how many of the problems that we face would go away, right? Especially for younger men, this is a problem. This is an especially big problem for younger men who, as Simone de Beauvoir says, always think that they are transcendent to biology or always out running ahead of themselves. What Heidegger is saying is you have to learn to tarry with finitude. You have to learn to sit with the fact that all your projects might fall apart, that the people in your life might die, that you might die. And instead of sitting there being fearful about that or distracting yourself from that fear by doing superficial curiosity in a non-committal way, saying, no, that's all the more reason to grab hold of life, to make active decisions, and to take this resolute approach to my possibilities. You can squeeze this out
for hours and hours and hours. And I don't have the time to do that. Of course, over the next year, I'd like to start doing that with you all. I'd like us to all start thinking deeper about these things. And then finally, if I said that we can springboard from ambiguity into modal understanding, and we can springboard from non-committal curiosity as a form of attunement into anticipatory resoluteness, well, then we can also springboard finally from the last of those existentialia, the one that is, what's the watered down version of discourse? It's idle chatter. What's the watered down version of being always already in the world, at home in the symbolic order? It's passing the word along in a way that doesn't take responsibility for what you're really saying or thinking. And obviously, so all three of those things meld together in falling, and we're constantly caught up in that cycle. But what Heidegger is getting at with the idea of being in the world as the essential structure or the fundamental structure of Dasein is to say Dasein versus world is not the same as the split subject versus object. Dasein's structure is being in the world. Its being is the being of being in the world. What does that mean? Well, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we get into with thrownness and falling and projection. And then we can talk about how those map onto the past, or he says having been, with the present, and then the future. But all of that, and then these other fundamental existentials, including care, which is so important, or how we get active about taking on our projection and onto that horizon of possibilities. All of that is stuff that we have to come back to. But for now, I just want to leave you with this idea that Verstehen and Befindlichkeit and Rede, or understanding, attunement, and discourse, that these three things, being existentially equiprimordial, he calls that disclosedness. And the disclosedness is what you're also thinking of, Ian, when you were referring to the clearing, this metaphor he uses for walking through the woods and then coming into a clearing. Disclosedness is the clearing. But if you're in the dark and you're in falling and you're in Plato's cave and you can't even find your way to a clearing, you might want to slipstream off somebody, try to follow somebody who's trodden a lot more paths than you. That might be one way. You also might want to start just cutting trees down around you. I don't know. And so there's all kinds of ways of trying to do that. Do you have an axe? What kind of tools do you have? These are important questions. But if Verstehen, Befindlichkeit, and Rede are the three fundamental existentialia, I want to leave off with this idea that time energy is a fourth. It sucks to put a fourth thing in, right? Threes are so much better. Should time energy be considered a fourth of the fundamental existentialia that is a fundamental structure of our being in the world? Or should it be more fundamental than those three? Right? Well, what about nature, nurture, natality? The three N's. Where do they belong in all of this? And I'm not talking about nature as in the kind of nature we get from the natural attitude through the sciences, which matters, which is part of nature, but I'm also talking about nature in the sense of there are essential tendencies, which means averagely occurring tendencies in the natural world, and we're a part of that natural world, and those tendencies can be countered to a certain degree without burning out, and they can be harnessed to a certain extent without destroying the planet. But how we counter and harness the tendencies of nature is a question of nurture, not of social constructivism. And nurturing, which has to do with cultivation, is a different way of dwelling in the world than this scientific, instrumentalized, Heidegger would say, and framing approach. It all fits together. And finally, the question of family. If we're thinking natality, if we're thinking about radical opportunities for newness, which is how Hannah Arendt, the Heideggerian, the sort of Heideggerian, talks about being towards birth, which is to say your child will not be like you. They'll have parts of you in them, but they'll also, through the synthesis of you and your partner and the rest of the world being different, have opportunities for radically new takes on things and doing stuff very differently, right? How does nature, nurture, natality fit into the structure of worldhood? How does time energy fit into the structure of worldhood? This is what I want to be thinking about. I'll close on this provocative idea. I believe that Heidegger is correct, that blood and soil are the fundamental thing. I just think that the blood that matters and the soil that matters are fundamentally different than the kinds he has in mind. That his idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, of the essential community, the national Volk, it's starting on the wrong side of things. This is an ideological product of political philosophers and statesmen and the PMC of his time. This is not reality. Reality is that it starts at home. It starts with the family. And that if the state were to fall away, or if there was a time where new states were rising and then going out over and over and over again, families are the one through line. And that every successful state acts like a family. But that the cachet of that metaphor only works if families are working. And that it actually only takes a few people to make a family. And it actually calls into question the legitimacy of the state. And of course, social constructivist PMC people want to act like you can make it any which way you please. But if we just look across humanity, across every large-scale civilization, there's going to be certain things that work and certain things that don't work. And that's edgy. Because as soon as you start getting into that, I said large-scale civilization. That brackets out how hunter-gatherers live and asks, well, how does it work for people in ancient Chinese, Greek, Roman, Babylonian city-states? There's always going to be certain ways that families can exist. And the health and wealth and success of those states has something to do with those families. And the metaphor that is the legitimation narrative of those nation states, the metaphor, their legitimation narrative, which is the king is your father, the nation is your family, like those metaphors only work if families are working. And so if Christopher Lasch wants to say that family is the haven in a heartless world, for us, I think it's usually too far gone. It's like, no, it's not. It's not even a haven. It's a fucking nightmare. The family is not a haven. Yep. But guess what? With every baby, with every new life, as Hannah Arendt says, being towards birth tells us there's a radical new opportunity for doing things differently. And in part, doing things differently means learning from the past, those things that work. And so what does it mean to learn from those things that work and then project that onto our horizon of possibilities when it comes to finding and building family together? I'm not saying all of us, I'm not saying in a parasocial way that we should all do this together. I'm saying that we should each be trying to do this with other people in our lives, right? And that maybe TU can be a place where we have a meta conversation about the touching grass that we do out there in the world, where we theorize that praxis. But ultimately, I think that the way to do this is by reading Being in Time, and that it is the most important book of philosophy or work of philosophy from the 20th century. And I have made it now available to all subscribers at TU. All past courses are available to you on that list of playlists. It's on your tab if you go to your profile tab. So Being in Time is all there now. You can do it on your own at your own pace. This series is going to assume that you're working at that or that you might work at that. I don't care. You don't have to be reading the book right now to be getting a lot out of these conversations, I hope. And like I said, we don't have time for conversation today. I got to close this out right now, but we will do a lot more of this in the future. I encourage you all to stick around and talk, but I've got to go, and I'll listen to anything you guys talk about later. But if you got to go too, just get after it. And the main thing that I'm hoping everybody will listen to was everything I've said up until now. So thank you, and see you on the next one. I'll send you all when it will be as soon as I hear back from a couple of people who I was hoping would be here, and I've got to try to plan them into the next one. But I'm hoping it could be something like this time, because this is a good time to meet, I think, for me. So thank you, everybody. Quick little postscript here. I was building up to and kept driving at this theme of bracketing as one of the most important moves in the method that gets called phenomenology. And I was talking about how
for Descartes, it was a bracketing against this scholastic approach, whereas for Husserl, it was bracketing against the natural attitude, which, can also be called scientism. Well, for Heidegger, it's a sort of bracketing against the idea of a minimalist, presuppositionalist philosophy. He says one of the issues is not that someone like Descartes has presuppositions hidden in his philosophy. It's that he doesn't have enough presuppositions from the outset. They're just ones that need to be clarified and well-founded. And being in time is all about trying to establish a set of presuppositions that have to be flushed out before any future philosophizing can really get off the ground. It's what I love about it. It's what a lot of people love about it. It's totally worth checking out if you haven't gotten into it. It's awesome. And so, I just wanted to kind of reiterate that because I feel like in my rush to close this thing out, I could have said that a little bit more clearly. But yes, presuppositions are not bad. In fact, they're important. And the presuppositions of worldhood itself, the existentialia, those are what we have to get to. If you want to go deeper into Theory Underground's back catalog of content, or join our currently ongoing courses and seminars, all you have to do is become a subscriber at theoryunderground.com/subscribe.